Okay, to discuss this, let's go to our panel now. In the Malaysian city of Kota Kinabalu is Osman. He's a senior fellow at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs and was once the political secretary for former Prime Minister Najib Razak. In Singapore is Mohamed Nawab, Mohamed Osman. He's the coordinator of the Malaysia program at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And finally, in West Jerusalem is Diker. He's the former Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Nawab, Osman, let me begin with you. First of all, was it justifiable from the Malaysian perspective to decide to ban the Israeli athletes in the first place?
The decision, obviously, is one that is extremely political in nature. The support for the Palestinian people and the anti-Israeli sentiment, especially amongst Muslims in Malaysia, has always been extremely strong. And as a result, I think this government is perhaps careful and worried about the impact of any sort of support, or the lack of support given to the Palestinian people. So I'm not saying that it's justifiable, but I think this is very much a decision that is politically calculated. There is an upcoming by-election in Malaysia, where in a seat that is a Malay majority seat, nearly 70%. And I think the government is making a decision with an eye towards the election, the by-election, and also ensuring that the political support amongst the Malay Muslims remain with the government.
Okay. I was going to go to Osman next, but I want to get Diker to come in first. Diker, in response to Malaysia barring the Israeli athletes, we've had the IPC say, okay, you don't get to host this event. Are you satisfied? Are you happy that they took that decision?
Yes, I think that the IPC and Mr. Parsons acted responsibly. You know, with all of the political hustle and tussle about Israel, what President Mahathir did was to deny Israeli Muslim Palestinians who are on the Paralympic swimming team from participating with their fellow Muslims in a Muslim majority country. So this whole notion of helping the Palestinians is utter nonsense. What they've done is, what the Malaysians have done is to punish themselves, isolate themselves, and probably throw up a big red flag to any future hosting of future international events. And who got hurt in the end? All of these wonderful Paralympic athletes, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, who in brotherly and sisterly cooperation were wanted to participate together.
Okay, but trying to dig into and drill down and look at the intentions here, they're not necessarily talking about the Israeli Palestinians or Arab Israelis who are citizens of Israel. They're talking about the treatment of Palestinians within the occupied territories, right? So you have the foreign minister.
No, they're not. No, they're not. No, you're
but
not.
They are.
That's incorrect.
Okay, so let me give you what the foreign minister said.
Prime Minister Mahathir. No. I'm going to make the answer before you ask me the next question. Let's be very clear about this. The leader of Malaysia, Prime Minister Mohamed Mahathir, has said that Jews have hooked noses, that Jews rule the world by proxy, and that Israel is a criminal state. He is not talking about not talking about one political policy in the West Bank. He's talking about destroying the Jewish democratic nation state. Let's be very clear about this to all of our viewers.
So he wrote a book called The Malay Dilemma, and in that he used anti-Semitic stereotypes. That is undoubtedly clear. He wrote about Jews having hooked noses, that they control the world by proxy. Be that as it may, he wrote that in a book. What I'm saying is that in his current defense right now, or in his current argument, and the foreign minister's current argument, what they're saying is Israel has an occupation of Palestinian lands, and because of human rights violations, and because of the treatment of Palestinians within the occupied territories, they've decided to take a political stance, right? So from their perspective, it's similar to the isolation of apartheid South Africa, no normal sport in an abnormal society. From that perspective, do you respect any of that, or does this purely come from anti-Semitism?
The perspective is absurd because of the fact that Malaysia has full relations with the biggest rights-violating regime in the world, which is the Iranian regime, the North Korean criminal regime, and therefore it's going to choose the only democratic country in the Middle East in which Arab Muslims have the same exact rights in Israel as Israeli Jews and Christians. And you're going to isolate that and compare it to the former apartheid criminal regime, which claimed white superiority over everyone else. That comparison is totally absurd. So if you want to try to draw out a more sophisticated argument, one might say, well, how do you compare it to the decision of, for example, President Trump, who barred people from Muslim-majority countries from immigrating to the United States? Then you can have some sort of discussion.
And he has
about
actually.
that,
so that's
perhaps.
interesting. That's interesting, Dan, because he's done the same. He's mentioned on his blog. Mahathir's 93 and he has a blog. I'm totally impressed, right? He says, he compares it to, well, Trump can keep Muslims out. He speaks about America's wall. He says America's erecting a very high wall to prevent Mexicans from going to America. He even speaks about Viktor Orban referring to Syrian refugees as Muslim invaders. That's fascinating, and that kind of helps us psychoanalyze him. And he's also saying, well, the others are doing this. Why don't you have a problem with that? Let me bring in O.I. Sun now to pick up on a point that Dan Diker made. Has Malaysia made a foreign policy faux pas? Because Dan makes a good point. Okay, fine. You want to look at the Israelis? Why aren't you looking at the North Koreans? Why aren't you looking at the Iranians? Why aren't you looking at the Saudis? Why aren't you looking at the Chinese and Myanmar and so on and so forth? We can go on forever. Why has Malaysia decided specifically to focus on Israel?
Well, I think there's this notion among the majority Muslims in Malaysia, this sort of worldwide solidarity with the Muslim brothers in their mind. And very often, I think they don't quite understand that among the Palestinian populations, for example, they are Muslims, they are Christians, and so on. Very often, they equate the whole Palestinian population with Muslims, and thereby, on the principle of Muslim solidarity worldwide, very often the Malaysian government, and this cuts across the political divide. Both Dr. Mahathir and his predecessor, namely Mr. Najib, they have both banned Israeli athletes or participants in international seminars from entering Malaysia. So as long as this notion of, I think, worldwide Muslim solidarity is still very much entrenched in the power that be, I think this policy is very difficult to be overturned.
Right. Dan Diker, you said that this has isolated Malaysia, right? What we're hearing from the other two guests, the two other Malaysian guests, is that actually this might have boosted Malaysia's Ummah credentials, if you like, from a lot of Muslim majority countries and Arab countries to say, well, finally, at least somebody like Malaysia is standing up for our Palestinian brothers and sisters.
Yes, but the Palestinians themselves, you folks, are completely out of touch with the Palestinian public. They're the #1 haters of their own government in Ramallah. They're the #1 supporters of connections of a socioeconomic relationship with Israel. And in fact, there is no such thing as worldwide Muslim solidarity.
Well, what poll are you quoting of the Palestinians? I mean, the Palestinians wanting to make a connection with Israel. Are you going to show me, I don't know, crowds of thousands of people with Netanyahu placards?
You should leave. Why don't you? I'll tell you what. You leave your TV studio in Istanbul, and I'll take you on a tour of the Palestinian territories.
Oh, I've been.
And we'll turn the cameras
off. I've been to Gaza. I've been to the West Bank.
You ask them who their #1. You ask them who their #1 opponent is, and they will tell you the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas.
They say it's the Israeli occupation. I've been to Gaza. I've been to the West Bank. I've been to refugee camps. You're drinking the Kool-Aid, my dear friend. What Kool-Aid am I drinking?
You're drinking the Kool-Aid.
We have soldiers. We have to pass through checkpoints.
You're drinking the Kool-Aid that
we have to pass through soldiers' checkpoints to get to work and school. That's not Mahmoud Abbas. That's the Israeli occupation.
Listen, I don't want to embarrass you on international
television.
Go ahead.
But I
give it a go.
Try to embarrass me.
Go for it.
Go for it. Go for it.
Listen, your Hamas-supporting president, Mr. Erdogan, is the #1 arch enemy of the Palestinians in Ramallah,
South African.
even
President
though he
Erdogan's
supports
not my
the Palestinians
president, but
in Gaza.
Please continue. Go ahead.
Now, if you're South African, the PLO has been basically gang raping your apartheid.
I don't ask my questions based on my passport. I'm asking based on the situation and the story that we're covering. So I'm asking you. You made a point here, right, Dan? So you said, Dan, the Palestinians are the biggest supporters of connections with the Israelis. I'm saying, because you said, I want to take you on a tour of the Palestinian territories, I'm saying I've been to the West Bank multiple times. I've been to Gaza as well. Palestinians tell me, you know what? Our lives would be a whole lot better if the Israelis stopped the occupation. That's what I'm saying, based not only on anecdotal evidence, but on empirical evidence. So I'm saying, where's your evidence that the Palestinians are big supporters of the Israelis? I don't understand.
Okay, you know what? I'm going to send you my latest research book from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs that I wrote with 5 Palestinians on the record. Okay. And then you'll review that, and we'll have another episode of your program, and then we'll have another review of the populist false claims that you're making.
But Dan, what I'm saying is the Palestinians, of course, they hate their leadership. But to claim that the Palestinians are major fans of this current Israeli government, you're telling me you're going to be embarrassing me on that issue? Come on, can you seriously make that claim?
Listen, my dear friend, or as they say in South Africa, China, listen, you must understand one thing. There are 30,000 Palestinians in Area C of the West Bank that are now earning 10 times more than the average doctor in Cairo.
So occupation is fantastic because it's better than Cairo. It's better than Sisi's Cairo, so it's fantastic.
You know something? From your point of view, my dear friend from South Africa, all of Israel is one big occupation. So if you're going to make that argument, you mislead your...
Did I say that all of Israel is under occupation? Did I say all of Israel is under occupation?
No, your view is... Tell your viewers what Israel is acceptable to you in your eyes.
I follow the UN consensus because as a journalist, not a South African.
Is it the 47?
I'm a journalist, not a South African.
Is it the Israel of 1948, 1949,
sure,
1967? Which Israel?
Whatever the United States.
Which Israel? I want you to share.
Certainly, Dan.
I want you to share your great expertise on Israel and the Middle East.
As a state is what is recognized by the world, and also the West Bank is recognized by the United Nations as being under occupation, and Gaza is recognized as being under blockade by the Israelis. There's no argument there, right? This is a basic common consensus. And from that point,
no, I think
not as a South African, but as a journalist, I decide to ask my question. So Dan, you made a lot of presumptions about me. I've let it slide. I'm going to go to the other guests now and try to go back to the issue now, if you don't mind, because there's a lot of stuff about me being a South African, about my president, and so on and so forth. I'm going to let it slide. You've questioned my integrity. You've questioned my credibility. I'm going to let it slide, right? I'm asking you questions here.
I've questioned your credibility.
Okay, sure.
But your credibility
because
is wrong
I asked you
because
questions
you've misquoted the United
like.
Nations.
What?
You've misquoted the United Nations.
According to the United Nations, the West Bank is under occupation. I mean, if we can't accept that...
Is that right?
Of course
is that right? Are you?
So what is the West Bank?
Well, listen, my friend, that you don't understand. Then you don't understand.
So why are
UN
the soldiers and the checkpoints there? What are they there for? Are they there for a holiday?
Which checkpoints are you talking about?
Tell me which
checkpoints
Have you ever passed through Kalandia? Why is there checkpoints in Kalandia? What are they there for? Are they there to give the Palestinians sweets?
Well, obviously, you don't know anything about the Oslo Accords that were signed in 1995 and that basically sanctioned. Well, why don't you ask the international community and especially the Europeans, the UN, the EU, and the other countries that approved Oslo II, by which Israel and the Palestinian Authority are conducting the relationship.
I'll be sure to ask all of them after this show.
Well, you obviously don't know because you wouldn't be asking these questions if you knew.
Okay, the West Bank is not under occupation according to Dan Diker. Let me bring in Nawab Osman.
No,
Nawab,
the West Bank is under dispute.
Oh, it's
the
under
West
dispute
Bank is under international dispute as sanctioned by the Oslo Accords.
Nawab
and you need
Osman,
to say that if you want to.
Dan, you're going to filibuster. Can I ask the other guest a question?
Please do.
Okay, Nawab Osman. So now, when we look at where Malaysia is heading, as this is one of the initially huge foreign policy tests of the new administration, what does that tell us about where it might be going from here on in, and how that foreign policy might be calibrated?
Now, I think one aspect of the foreign policy that has been fairly, similar, regardless of the prime minister. In fact, it started out in the first Mahathir administration, subsequently Abdullah Badawi, Najib, and the second Mahathir administration, is this sense of solidarity, which Oisan mentioned earlier, with the larger Muslim community. So Dr. Mahathir, for example, during the Bosnian War, provided a lot of support to the Bosnian people. A lot of them were given citizenship even in Malaysia. And this sort of pan-Islamic or pro-Islamic type of foreign policy is very much a characteristic of the current government under Dr. Mahathir. And I don't think this is going to change anytime soon, even with future prime ministers. But one point I think that is important to note is that this is done with the view of the domestic audience. As Osman mentioned as well, there is very strong support, especially for the Palestinian cause, perhaps stronger than any other Muslim causes, be it the Uyghur, the Rohingyas, and so on.
Yeah, but that's the point, right? So, Nawab, the point is, if there's an issue of the Uyghurs and people care about what's happening to the Uyghurs, why doesn't Malaysia boycott China?
Because it does not serve its domestic political interests. As I mentioned, this is a foreign policy that is enacted with the view of the domestic audience. So with that in mind, the Uyghur issue does not have much traction.
Right.
Most Malaysians, for example, don't know about the Uyghur issues, or even for that matter, the Rohingyas. I mean, I was just in Malaysia, and there were a lot of I've got a project looking at humanitarian aid that Malaysian organizations provide. And even many of my interviewees talk about how it's a lot easier to raise funds for Palestinian causes than perhaps for the Rohingyas, even though I think the situation in Myanmar is perhaps worse than that in
and that's a deeper and that's an interesting one, because we're going to look into that, and we have touched on it on the Newsmakers before, right? Why the kind of silence, or rather condemnation with a ceiling or a limitation when it comes to Myanmar, or the Chinese when it comes to the Uyghurs? And that's an interesting point. We will no doubt have more discussions about that. Oi Sun, from the comments that we've heard from Mahathir, from the comments that we've heard from the Foreign Minister Datuk Saifuddin Abdullah, getting stripped of this particular event, not getting to host it, not getting the international prestigiousness, and maybe down the line, maybe not even getting awarded other sporting events because of this issue. Is it a price worth paying for the Malaysian political establishment?
Well, Malaysia, like many other countries, primarily will focus on its domestic politics, just like the United States and perhaps Israel as well. And therefore, it is politically more expedient for the government of the day to take this decision. I personally, I think there is perhaps some other option. For example, I think one of Malaysia's neighboring countries, Indonesia, they similarly, I think, do not have diplomatic relations with Israel. But, I think the people of both countries, they travel freely to each other.
Right.
I have Israeli friends who have taken vacation in Indonesia, for example. So at the official level, they don't maintain the official contact, but at the people-to-people level, they keep on going. So that perhaps it's a model for to refer to. Yes.
Right. So you'd like the Malaysians to maybe take the Indonesian approach with a slightly softer tone. Listen, gentlemen, I'm going to move on, but I thank you for joining us. Oi Sun, Nawab, Osman, and Dan Diker, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.